On a Tuesday morning in October of 2019, Marcus Drell stood at the edge of a collapsed Victorian foundation in Harlan County, Iowa, and watched $300,000 worth of diesel equipment fail him for the fourth day in a row. The house itself was already gone, torn down 6 weeks earlier to make way for the 12-unit housing development Marcus had been planning since 2016. The permits were in order. The investors were patient, but not infinitely so. The concrete crew was scheduled to arrive in 11 days, and the only thing standing between Marcus and the pour date was a 70-foot section of hand-poured limestone block foundation that had been in the ground since 1887 and did not appear to have any intention of coming out of it. Marcus was 41 years old. Now, he had built Drell Land and Site Development from a borrowed skid steer and a $4,000 line of credit at a local bank into a 12-employee operation with a 6-county footprint and a backlog that stretched 18 months into the future. He had cleared flood-damaged bottomland in Pottawatomie County. He had demolished a condemned grain elevator in Shelby. He had dug out a collapsed tunnel beneath a 19th-century mill in Audubon that 3 other contractors had walked away from. He was not a man who was in the habit of standing next to equipment that wasn't moving and accepting that as a final answer. But the foundation was not cooperating. Let me tell you about the foundation itself, because you need to understand what it was before you can understand why it refused to move. The original builder, a German Lutheran immigrant named Gottlieb Harms, had poured that foundation in the fall of 1887 using a technique common to skilled European stonemasons of the period. The limestone blocks were not simply stacked and mortared. They were interlocked using a pattern called running bond with diagonal keystones, where every third course of block was angled inward at a 15-degree pitch, creating a structure that distributed load across the entire wall rather than concentrating it at any single point. On top of that, the previous owners of the house, the Harms family, who had occupied the property for 4 of the 5 generations between 1887 and 2003, had, at some point in the 1940s, poured a reinforced concrete cap across the top of the limestone wall. Now, this cap was tied into the blocks below using rebar that someone had driven vertically through pre-drilled holes directly into the original stone. The result was a hybrid structure. 19th-century limestone bonded to mid-century concrete with rebar running through the seam like stitches through skin, all of it sitting on a clay shelf that had been compressing for 132 years and had by this point become something close to ceramic. Marcus's first excavator, a Caterpillar 320 with a hydraulic thumb, had fractured 2 teeth on its bucket trying to get under the concrete cap. The second attempt, made with a Komatsu PC210 with a hydraulic hammer attachment, had broken the cap along a diagonal line and driven the upper section of the limestone wall 6 inches deeper into the ground before the hammer overloaded its circuit and shut itself down. The third approach was Marcus's own idea. He brought in a Kobelco SK350, the largest excavator in his fleet, 40 tons of orange iron, fitted with a demolition shear that his equipment yard had trucked down from Council Bluffs. The shear cracked the concrete cap in 4 places and compressed 3 sections of limestone block, but did not pull a single cubic foot of the wall out of the ground. The clay held everything in place like a fist. The wall absorbed the shear's force and redistributed it through the interlocked keystones and simply refused. By Tuesday morning, Marcus had spent $31,000 in machine time, fuel, repairs, and subcontractor costs. His crew chief was leaving him voicemails with a tone that had shifted from concerned to quietly furious, and he had a hole in his schedule that was growing by a day every time he looked at it. That was when the green pickup truck pulled onto the side. Let me tell you about Harlan Peck, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did next. Harlan Peck was 77 years old in 2019 and had farmed the same 460 acres 3 miles east of town for 51 years. His grandfather, Edwin Peck, had homesteaded the original 160 acres in 1903. His father, Raymond, had expanded it through the Depression by buying the adjacent parcels when 3 neighboring families couldn't make their property taxes, and he had bought them at a fair price, because Raymond Peck was not the kind of man who considered another family's hardship an opportunity. Harlan had inherited the land in 1968 when Raymond died of a coronary at 63, and he had spent the following 5 decades doing what Pecks had always done: planting corn and beans, rotating his fields, maintaining his equipment, and paying close attention to what was happening around him. He was not loud. He had never in his adult life raised his voice at another man on purpose. He drove a 2004 GMC Sierra that had 209,000 miles on it and ran the way he kept everything, with quiet competence. He did not go to the county fair to show things. He went to see what other people were doing. He did not complain about the weather, the markets, or the government, not because he didn't have opinions, but because he'd found over the course of 77 years that talking about problems rarely solved them. He had been watching Marcus's operation from the road for 4 days. He had watched the first excavator grind its teeth on the concrete cap and pull back. He had watched the hydraulic hammer drive the wall deeper. He had watched the demolition shear compress and crack and fail to extract. He had not said anything to anyone. He had driven past in the morning and again in the evening, and he had thought about what he was watching, and he had reached a conclusion. On Tuesday morning, he turned his truck into the site drive. Let me tell you about what was in the bed of that truck, because what was there requires some explanation. Harlan was towing a gooseneck trailer. On the trailer sat a machine that Marcus's crew chief, a 34-year-old man from Omaha named Derek Scholl, would later describe as something that had escaped from a museum. It was an Oliver H.G. Cletrac crawler tractor, built in 1941. Painted in its original burnt orange, though the paint was faded to something closer to the color of dried rust in full sunlight. The machine weighed 7,300 pounds. Its maximum belt pull, a measurement of sustained, continuous pulling force at the drive sprocket, was listed in its original specification sheet as 6,800 pounds. It had steel cleats on its tracks, not rubber. It had no cab, no hydraulics, no computerized load management system, and no circuit breaker that would interrupt the engine if the pull exceeded a safe threshold. It had a hand clutch, that's a foot brake, a throttle, and a steel drawbar bolted to the rear frame that Harlan Peck had replaced in 1986 because the original had cracked and he'd decided to weld in a heavier section while he was at it. Harlan had bought the Cletrac from the estate sale of a man named Vernon Ostrander in 1973 for $250. Vernon had used it for clearing fence lines. Harlan had kept it because his father had told him once that a crawler with a low gear ratio and continuous track contact was worth keeping, regardless of what the equipment dealers said, and Raymond Peck's opinions on mechanical matters had rarely turned out to be wrong. The Cletrac had been maintained with the same regularity and care as every other piece of equipment on the Peck farm. Oil changed every season. tracks inspected every spring. The carbureted engine rebuilt once in 1994 by Harlan himself using a set of cast replacement rings he'd sourced from a supplier in Minnesota that still carried vintage Oliver parts. Harlan backed the trailer to the edge of the site, unloaded the Cletrac under its own power, and walked over to where Marcus was standing. He said, "I think I know what's happening with your wall." Marcus looked at the old crawler and then at Harlan Peck and said nothing for a moment. Derek Scholl, standing nearby with a cup of gas station coffee, had a response that was less restrained. What Scholl said, and he would apologize for it directly and at length 3 days later, was that this was a nice piece of junk, but that they needed equipment that weighed 40 tons, not 4. Harlan didn't look at Scholl. He kept his eyes on Marcus. Marcus was polite. He was raised to be polite. He said he appreciated the offer, but that he had 40 tons of excavator on site, and that hadn't been enough. He said the concrete cap had been cracked and the limestone underneath was locked in clay, and he wasn't sure a vintage crawler was going to change that equation. Harlan said, "Your machines are pushing and compressing. The clay is absorbing the energy and transferring it into the keystone angles. Every time you hit it, you're setting it deeper." He said it without heat or impatience, the way a man explains something he has thought through carefully and arrived at with confidence. He said, "You need to pull, not push, not hammer. Pull. And you need to pull at an angle that runs against the keystone pitch, which means low, horizontal, and sustained." Marcus said that crawler's pull rating is less than 7,000 pounds. Harlan said, "Drawbar horsepower isn't the same as pull. Pull is torque times time. That machine will pull at its rated load continuously without flinching for as long as the engine has fuel. Your hydraulic excavator generates peak pull for 3 to 5 seconds, and then the load management system bleeds pressure to protect the circuits." He paused and said, "The clay isn't holding because it's strong. It's holding because every time you hit it hard and fast, it compresses. You have to pull slow and steady long enough for the clay to shear instead of compress. Your machines aren't built to do that. Mine is. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone struggle with a problem and known, with absolute certainty, that you understood what they were missing? Have you ever been in the position of having to stand there with the answer in your hand and wait for another person to be ready to hear it? That is where Harlan Peck was standing. He had the answer. He had brought the answer on a trailer, and he was patient enough to wait as long as it took for Marcus Drell to come to the point of needing to hear it. Marcus looked at the Cletrac for a long time. Then he looked at the wall. Then he looked at Harlan Peck. He said, "If it falls apart trying, it's on you." Harlan said, "It won't fall apart." Let me tell you about the next 4 hours because they are the reason this story is still being told in Harlan County. Harlan spent the first 40 minutes on preparation. Marcus's crew stood in a loose semicircle and watched. And what they watched was methodical in a way that made several of them uncomfortable, because it was so unhurried. Harlan walked the full length of the exposed foundation wall. He crouched at intervals and pressed his palm against the limestone and looked at the angle of the concrete cap where it had been cracked by the demolition shear. He identified 3 sections of the wall where the keystone pattern was visible in the cracked cap's cross-section. He spent 10 minutes examining these sections with the focused attention of someone reading a document in a language they are fluent in. Then he went to his truck and came back with a coil of 3/4 inch grade 70 chain and a set of load binders. The chain was old but not worn. It had been cleaned and coiled and fastened with a wire tie. He also had a come-along ratchet, two J-hooks rated at 8,000 pounds, and a piece of equipment that several of Marcus's crew members didn't immediately recognize. A ground anchor, the kind used in utility work, a 40-inch steel rod with a helix blade at one end that Harlan drove into the earth at a 45-degree angle using a steel driving bar and a 16-pound maul, placing it 60 feet from the wall in a position that Marcus's crew chief later calculated was aimed directly against the pitch angle of the lowest course of keystone blocks. Harlan drove the anchor in 8 blows, not one more. He tested it by putting his weight on the driving bar. He nodded and went back to the Cletrac. He ran the chain from the ground anchor back to the drawbar of the Cletrac. He ran a second chain from the drawbar down the slope and connected it through the J-hooks to the lower exposed section of the limestone wall, at the precise point where the concrete cap's crack had revealed the face of the first angled keystone course. He set the ratchet come along between the 2 chain runs to equalize the load. He checked every connection twice. He walked the full chain run from the anchor to the machine to the wall and checked it again. Nobody said anything. He climbed onto the Cletrac. He let it idle for 2 minutes. He advanced the throttle to a specific position. Not wide open, not half, something closer to 2/3. And then he engaged the drive clutch slowly, with a deliberateness that was almost ceremonial, until the chains went taut. For a long moment, nothing seemed to happen. The Cletrac's engine changed pitch. Not dramatically. A subtle deepening, the kind of sound a strong man makes when he's lifting something heavy and has decided he is going to lift it regardless of what it weighs. The steel cleats pressed into the clay soil of the site with a sound like boots on wet gravel. The chains, all of them, went from slack to rigid in a sequence that moved down the line like a slow exhalation. And then the machine pulled. It pulled at 3 miles per hour, which is the kind of speed that doesn't look like anything from a distance. It pulled steadily, with no surge, no shock, no cyclone of hydraulic pressure. The engine did not falter. The tracks did not spin. The chains held their tension at a load that Harlan had set with the equalization ratchet and would not exceed. An inch, maybe 2, of movement in the first 5 minutes. Marcus was watching the wall, and he would say later that he almost missed it because he was expecting something dramatic. It was not dramatic. The limestone moved the way a very heavy drawer moves when you pull it slowly, with initial resistance and then a subtle easing, as if whatever was holding it had made a decision. Derek Scholl took 1 step forward. At 7 minutes, a sound came up from the earth beneath the wall that was not the sound of cracking stone or snapping chain. It was lower than that, broader, the sound that clay makes when it stops compressing and starts to shear, a deep, wet, tearing note that the men standing nearby felt as much as heard. One of Marcus's laborers, a 22-year-old from Council Bluffs named Trey, said later that it felt like the ground cleared its throat, and the wall moved 3 inches, then 6. Then, at 11 minutes, the first keystone block separated from the section beneath it, with a sound like a rifle shot, and the upper third of that 70-foot section of limestone began to rise. Not fast, not explosively. It rose the way a very old thing rises when it has finally been given permission to move, with immense gathering authority. Dirt and clay cascaded off the top of the blocks. The rebar that had been driven through the concrete cap bent and then screamed and then snapped in a sequence that moved from west to east along the wall like a slow zipper being opened. The concrete cap, already cracked, separated into 4 clean sections that fell outward into the excavated zone. And then the wall came. Trey from Council Bluffs made a sound. Someone else said, "Jesus." Derek Scholl's coffee cup hit the ground. The section of foundation, 70 feet of interlocked limestone block that had been in the earth since Grover Cleveland was in his first term, came out of the clay in a movement that took 9 seconds and looked, from where Marcus was standing, like watching something be born. It rose and tilted and landed on its side in the excavated zone with a concussion that Marcus felt in his chest. The Cletrac's engine returned to idle. Harlan Peck climbed down from the machine, walked to the chain connection at the wall, and began coiling chain. He did not look at Marcus. He did not look at the crew. He worked the same way he had prepared, unhurried, methodical, without ceremony. Marcus went pale. His arms dropped to his sides, but he stood looking at the overturned wall section, and then at the crawler, and then at the 70-year-old farmer who was coiling chain, and he did not say anything for a long time. Derek Scholl later described Marcus's face in that moment as the face of a man who was recalculating something he'd been certain about for his entire professional life. The crew erupted. Trey from Council Bluffs was yelling. 2 of the excavator operators were laughing the way men laugh when they don't know what else to do with what they're feeling. Someone started clapping. The site, which had been quiet with failure for 4 days, was suddenly very loud. Harlan finished coiling the chain. He tied it off with the wire tie. He walked back to the Cletrac and repositioned it for the second section. Let me tell you about what happened the following morning, because the story doesn't end with the foundation. Marcus Drell drove to Harlan Peck's farm at 7 o'clock. He had a check with him. The check was for $5,000, which he knew was inadequate, but he didn't know what the right number was and had decided to let Harlan name it. Harlan was in the shop when Marcus arrived, doing the thing Marcus would learn he always did at 7 in the morning, which was checking the oil on whatever piece of equipment he'd used the previous day. He wiped his hands on a red shop rag and listened to Marcus speak. Marcus said he owed him an apology and a payment. Harlan said he didn't need either. He said there was no reason a man of Marcus's experience would have known about the keystone pattern in that foundation, and because that style of construction hadn't been used commercially since before the Second World War and wasn't covered in any accreditation program he was aware of. He said Marcus hadn't been arrogant exactly. He said Marcus had trusted his equipment because his equipment had always been trustworthy, and that was a reasonable thing to do. Marcus said, "How did you know about the keystone pattern?" Harlan said, "Because my grandfather built a cellar in 1911 using the same technique, and my father pulled it out in 1957 with the same machine." He said my father spent 2 days trying with his other equipment before he got the Cletrac. Said it felt like pulling a tooth that was rooted wrong. Marcus said, "I had 40 tons on that wall." Harlan said, "Your 40 tons produced 3 to 5 seconds of peak pull. My machine produced 6 hours of continuous pull at the correct angle. Some problems," he said, "don't need more power. They need better thinking." Marcus left without cashing his check. Harlan wouldn't take it. He did, eventually, accept a donation in the amount of $5,000 to the Shelby County 4-H organization, which he'd been involved with for most of his adult life. That was the transaction, the whole of it. Let me tell you about the 6 years that followed because they matter. Marcus Drell changed the way he diagnosed foundation removal after that Tuesday in October. He added a consultation step to every job that involved pre-1950 construction. He started carrying copies of regional historical masonry guides in his truck. He called Harlan twice in the following year with questions about clay behavior and soil shear rates, and Harlan answered both calls with the same unhurried specificity he'd used at the site. Marcus would tell the story of the Harms Foundation at every contractor association meeting he attended for the next 5 years. He became the person in the room who asked, before approving any equipment plan for historic demolition, whether anyone had considered sustained pull methodology. He was, by his own account, a better contractor for having been wrong about something he thought he was certain of. Harlan kept farming. He didn't tell the Cletrac story himself because it wasn't a story to him. It was a job. He had seen a problem, recognized it, offered the solution, and done the work. The rest of it, the crew erupting, the pale-faced contractor, or the sense that something remarkable had happened, was the kind of thing other people needed to make into a story. Harlan didn't have a particular need for remarkable. He had 460 acres to look after. The Cletrac went back on its trailer and back into the machine shed on the east side of the Peck farm, and went on being maintained the way it always had been. Oil checked seasonally, tracks inspected in spring, the engine idling for 20 minutes every other month because Harlan believed that an engine that sat completely idle went soft in ways that were hard to reverse. Harlan Peck died in March of 2023 at the age of 81. Heart failure, the same as his father, though at a later age. His son, David Peck, who was 53 and had farmed alongside Harlan for most of his adult life, he held a service at the Lutheran Church in Erlin that 240 people attended, which was a significant number in a county of 11,000. David was not a man who talked much at gatherings, but he gave one remarks about his father that the people present still remembered a year later. He said Harlan's philosophy about machinery was the same as his philosophy about people. He said his father believed that something being old did not mean it was used up. He said it meant it had already proven what it could do. Let me tell you one last thing because it reaches forward in a way that closes the circle. In the fall of 2024, Marcus Drell's son, a 26-year-old named Eli who had joined the company 2 years earlier, was working a site in Cass County, a pre-war commercial foundation removal, limestone construction, a hand-poured deep clay shelf. The job had been going badly for 3 days. 3 days of an excavator grinding against a wall that refused to move, the clay holding everything in place, the equipment cycling its hydraulic pressure and backing off and cycling again. On the 4th morning, a pickup truck pulled onto the site. It was towing a gooseneck trailer. On the trailer was an Oliver H.G. Cletrac in burnt orange, faded to the color of dried rust in full sunlight. The man who climbed out was David Peck. He walked to where Eli Drell was standing and said, "I think I know what's happening with your wall." Eli had heard this story. His father had told it at dinner tables and job site breakdowns and contractor meetings for 5 years. He had heard it so many times that he knew the details: the chain, the ground anchor, the keystones, the equalization ratchet, the way the clay makes a sound when it shears instead of compresses. He had heard his father describe the way Marcus's arms had dropped to his sides and his face had gone pale, and how he had stood there recalculating something he'd been certain of his entire life. Eli said, "Yes." He said, "Yes, please show me." David Peck unloaded the crawler and began to prepare the chains, and Eli Drell watched every step of it with the particular attention of a young man who understood he was being shown something that would matter to him for a long time. The Peck family still has the Cletrac. David's son, a 17-year-old named Raymond, after his great-great-grandfather who bought that first 160 acres in 1903, has already been shown how to check the oil, how to inspect the tracks, how to set the equalization ratchet for a low-angle sustained pull. The equipment dealers who drive through Shelby County occasionally see it in the yard and ask if it's for sale. The answer is always no. The engineers who have looked at the machine have said it is mechanically simple to the point of being primitive. Harlan Peck would have agreed with them, and agreed also that this was precisely the point. That some things are built without complexity because complexity fails in ways that simple things do not, and that the clay in the earth of western Iowa does not care how much a machine cost, or what year it was manufactured, or whether it has a computerized load management system. It cares only about. That's the difference between machines that give up and machines that don't know how.